Welcome to the Cyber Fusion Report, the podcast where we cut through the noise and expose the gaps putting our enterprises and infrastructure at risk. I'm your host, Gary Mullen, and today we're tackling a truth most companies don't want to face. Your OT environments, the lifeblood of manufacturing, energy, and logistics, are the weakest link in your cybersecurity strategy. But there is a way forward, and it requires a new model, the Cyber Fusion Center. Let's get started. Welcome to the Cyber Fusion Report, Episode 4, powered by PhishCloud, where we cut through the noise and talk about what really matters in operational technology cybersecurity. Today we're talking about one of the most overlooked and most dangerous blind spots in critical infrastructure, operational technology, or OT. In IT, a missed alert might mean data loss, but in OT, it can mean downtime, damage, and even personal danger. Ransomware attacks against industrial environments are up 87%, and in 4 have resulted in full site shutdowns. 75% of those attacks began in IT before spilling over into the OT environment. But most companies still are relying on outdated penetration tests that barely scratch the surface. That's what we're unpacking today. Penetration testing versus red team assessments, and why the difference could save your organization millions. Joining us today are 2 industry heavyweights who have lived this reality from both sides of the console. Terry McCorkle, CEO and founder of PhishCloud, has spent his career redefining how organizations defend both the human layer and the industrial core, from phishing resilience to full spectrum cyber fusion. We also have Billy Rios, renowned security researcher, author, and co-founder of QED Secure Solutions. He's one of the foremost experts on uncovering vulnerabilities in medical devices, building automation, and critical infrastructure systems. His work has shaped how industries think about OT security, safety, and the human factor behind both. Together, we'll talk about what happens when traditional IT security meets real-world consequence, the hidden entry points that attackers exploit in OT environments, and why experience, not theory, is the true test of resilience. So let's get started, because in OT, there are no soft landings, only lessons you want to learn before the lights go out. Terry, I'm going to start with you with the first question that really talks about the difference between penetration testing and red team assessments. Most CISOs and compliance teams think that if they've done a pen test, they're secure, right? But you argue that that's not even close to being enough. What's the fundamental difference between a traditional OT pen test and a full OT red team assessment? And why does that difference matter in an industrial environment?
Yeah, so when you look at the industry and a traditional pen test, a lot of times you'll have a very defined scope. You're looking at a specific device or specific set of devices. In the OT world, it's difficult to actually scan those environments. So you've got a lot of different IT technologies that will focus on performing vulnerability scans and looking for known exploits. In the OT space, you have to assume you have exploits that are unknown that live in those environments. They're older machines, they're designed to live a long time, they have long lifespans, and they don't necessarily get the updates. So I know Billy and I have done a lot of research back in the day, and dealing with those vendors, some of them won't even admit there's vulnerabilities in their products. And then there's others that will do everything they can to try to fix what's been identified. But just because of the nature and how few people are actually looking at these systems and how few vulnerabilities are being published about these systems, you just have to assume that there are risks there. So from a red team perspective, where you look at it not just from what can you do if you get access to this device, but how would you lead to getting access into that environment? How would you get a foothold in that environment? And if once you're in a OT environment or operational environment, how would you stay there and be stealthy to learn about that environment? So we have to realize that attackers today, they'll live on a network in the operational space for years without being identified. And so you've got to realize that when you're looking at those OT environments, just going in and assessing a particular section of it, or access controls only, isn't going to give you the same perspective as giving a red team access to your environment and saying, tell us everything you can learn about this. You're
Mhm.
giving them some PCAP files so that they can understand the network that exists on and how those different devices communicate with each other. So it's got a combination of classic pen testing techniques where we understand how these environments work and how to attack them, but it also brings in the data analytics approach of looking at what's actually going on in the environment and figuring out the best ways to attack that, or how an attacker would attack that. So, long-winded answer, but it's it's just a slightly different approach. However, it gives a more realistic understanding of your environment.
Well, we're also giving them the ability to gauge how they respond if an event like that
Yeah.
happens. Isn't that right, Billy?
Yeah, totally. I think if you like had to draw like a delineation between a pen test and a red team, I would say that a pen test is technically focused, where you're focused on technologies, finding vulnerabilities in technologies, finding weaknesses in the technologies themselves. And the red team is focused on risk. Like they don't care about the technologies. I won't say they don't care, but the steps to get to achieve your objectives are kind of insignificant. The objective is the most important thing, and in that way, like pen tests are typically very well scoped because they're focused on a technology, or they're focused on a sector of the deployment or the IT that the organization wants to test, as opposed to a red team where you're focused on an objective. Because you're focused on an objective, usually a risk objective, the red team is almost, like, to quote Bruce Lee, they're like water, right? Like they're not going to get stuck on a specific technology or a specific area. They're going to find usually the path of least resistance and exploit that path, right? And
Mhm.
so from a organizational standpoint, that path of most high weakness is probably your most risky path, right? And that's why it kind of helps identify these risk areas for you to work on. So
Great. Well, you mentioned systems, and that kind of leads into the next question. In IT, a vulnerability scan is pretty routine. But
yeah,
in OT, in the plant floor, a wrong scan or a wrongly used scan can actually stop a production line cold, which costs
totally.
great deals of money. The stakes in the technology are completely different. So when you're working in an OT network and you're dealing with embedded systems like PLCs and SCADA systems and control loops, et cetera, how does assessing those differ from assessing systems in an IT network? And what are the challenges that you face in doing so in a red team assessment?
Yeah. Maybe I'll go first. I would say the first challenge is that the tools are terrible. Like I think a lot of times what we'll do is just kind of cram these IT tools into the square OT peg hole, right? So because it kind of feels like they're the same, like in the OT environment, you might have Windows systems, you might have Linux systems, and those tools should technically work, but they bring a lot of risk in just running them, especially if you don't understand how those tools are actually working. I know Terry has seen this too. Like people will be running these tools on a quarterly, time frame. It'll be causing the downstream OT systems to just do all sorts of bizarre things, and people just accept that, like, oh, that's kind of weird. We just reboot them every quarter after the IT vulnerability scan occurs, not realizing that those vulnerability scans are actually controlling processes, unintentionally, of course. And then it's a matter of time to where it either controls something to where it breaks or something catastrophic happens, right? So it's kind of appalling, right? And then On the other side, I would say as an industry, we're kind of bad about taking technical vulnerabilities and translating that into impact, right? So, the manufacturer, on a manufacturing floor, you may not care that you're running an outdated SSH daemon, right? So even though that's identified in some finding, but you do care that someone could take over the robot and swing the arm. But the reality is maybe that that old vulnerable SSH daemon actually does mean that someone could take over the arm and swing it. But we just don't translate that very well, right? So it's kind of this double-edged sword where the tools aren't very good, and we probably shouldn't be running a lot of the IT tools and OT. And then translating vulnerabilities into what real impact is, that's our responsibility as well. I think we've kind of failed there sometimes. So.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at it also from a red team versus traditional pen test, if you're looking at the how you're going to get access to that information, right? And that's really what you're doing. If you're running a vulnerability scan, you're trying to assess how vulnerable that environment is. There's an assumption, and should be an assumption, that most OT environments have vulnerable software just in their nature. So recognizing that from a red team perspective, a lot of times the first places we would target would be the engineering workstations, because they're going to have the spreadsheets with the devices listed. They're going to have access to potentially reach those devices, right, and get into those environments. They're definitely going to have the user credentials that you would need to interact with that environment, and they'll oftentimes have even things like ladder logic, so you can understand the process down to what are they doing in that environment. And I think people underestimate what can be learned when you get access to that kind of information, right? And to put Billy's point, a red team is designed to help give that business impact perspective, not just a vulnerability printout, right? A pen test shouldn't be just a list of vulnerabilities. It should be a list of how this is going to impact your business. What does this mean to an attacker and to your organization?
Yeah, I would say too, one other thing, I think maybe from a leadership management standpoint, we've seen this. I know I've been on engagements and missions with Terry where we've seen this. From a leadership and management perspective, red team assessments can be really uncomfortable. You know, it's one thing if you're talking about weaknesses in a technology because it's like this inanimate product. It doesn't have feelings. The firewall doesn't feel bad, when you run a 0-day against it. But red team engagements often involve people. They often involve weaknesses in process. They often take advantage of seams, and a lot of those seams are from people. Right. And so at the end of the day, when you're identifying and answering questions like, how did you get in? How did you get access to this? And you're talking about exploiting people or behaviors or just kind of the general kindness of employees in an organization, that can make you feel kind of bad, and that can make you uncomfortable, And so we've seen that as well, and I think that maybe that's one of the reasons why people maybe shy away from that, although it uncovers a lot of risk areas that should be considered because attackers don't care about feelings, right? Hackers don't care about feelings. But, it can be uncomfortable to kind of go back to employees and say, well, they got access to the power grid because you were friendly, right? So, so that's another piece too. If you're an executive, if you're a leader thinking about like, maybe we should do a red team here, some of those can be a little uncomfortable sometimes, right?
Yeah, and we'll talk about the human element in a question or two. But Terry, let me throw this to you. Many organizations believe their OT environments are air-gapped, isolated, or they think they're safe because they're behind the firewall. What are some of the unexpected entry points that you've seen attackers use to gain access not just to IT, but into an OT environment?
Yeah, we've done some crazy stuff over the years, Billy and I, and just going back to when we were both, in the Air Force together, and we had a whole team of people who had, I think we call it activating the evil bit, We had a whole bunch of evil bit people, and don't get me wrong, we all think through an attacker's process, methodology, tactics, and procedures and things of that nature. But nobody was malicious in intent. In other words, we're always taking that, white hat style approach, but you have to keep in mind what an attacker can actually do with this when you're, emulating these threats. And so, Billy and I have had some crazy things like phishing attacks where we were using cross-site scripting to, from their main landing page. So organization's landing page, we use a cross-site scripting attack on that to make it look like, we were an IT team sending a link to their page, and it would route them off to our attack and download files and whatever we needed to do. So there's that side of it, that human side of it, where it's just thinking outside of what a traditional phishing email may look like. And then you have the other side of it of looking at access avenues that people don't think about. So we did a lot with building management systems. And in doing that work, we realized a lot of times these building management systems sit in their own little DMZ. They may be separated in some capacity, but they're connected to other things like access management systems, or, they're also controlling large portions of the building. So just from an attack perspective, directly on a building management system, you can gain access to basically control whether they're able to use that building or not. And with today's technologies and the fact of how these things are managed, a lot of times they wouldn't even recognize that there was ever a cyber attack taking out their building management system. It wouldn't even be on the radar. But we were able to not only do that, we were able to get into those environments and then piggyback off of other machines and get into corporate networks through that method. So beyond just phishing, works almost every time, right? That gets us into most organizations. But outside of that, you have to realize that there are other things that are externally exposed. When you talk about an operational technology environment, right, you got to look at how are they gaining access to that. Maybe the building management system is connected to the same network. Highly likely, right? It's considered operational technology. But when you are looking at the actual environments, I think it's pretty common to have a VPN that's dedicated to get into an environment. More sophisticated, hopefully they're using things like YubiKeys or something to actually authenticate to get into those environments. But a lot of times you don't have that. So the phishing attack will get you to the engineering workstation that I mentioned earlier, and that a lot of times will show you the avenues in. They'll have the access plans. They'll have the information you need. Some organizations go as far as to implement one-way diode technology. That way they can actually really control what goes in and out. But back to what Billy was saying with human nature, right? The human element is what creates those gaps, and people are driven by simplicity. So it's very common to find firewall rules that have been put in for that engineering workstation to get in. And because they control those firewalls on the OT environment, sometimes there's just not oversight that happened, right? These environments will have their own Active Directory controllers. So traditional IT is not even going to see the access attempts, right? And that's where Cyber Fusion helps bring those gaps together. And a red team assessment can help assess, like, what can you actually do once you're in the environment, assuming you have valid credentials and you're now allowed to move across the environment. I think that initial access is getting more and more available, right? Especially with things like fake employees showing up all over the place now, right? So we've got to think, how is an attacker going to approach us, and then put that lens on it.
Yeah, I think about some of the ways Terry and I have gotten into organizations. Like we hacked a Coke machine once, got in through a Coke machine. We opened the door. We hacked an access control system once, opened the door for somebody to physically walk in after hours. Fake IDs, of course, printing that for red team stuff, for Air Force, Air Guard. Hacking building automation systems. I think we hacked a garage door once for a building, let people in that way. So man, we've done some pretty crazy stuff, and I think that kind of goes back to the whole red team mentality where, it's not like the customer or the organization was like, we want you to hack the garage. Like that never got brought up, but, you're able to kind of take a look at what's available, identify where weak points are, kind of like predator style heat maps of what's interesting and what you think you might be able to get access to. And then you go for that, right? And then I think a good red team, can quickly understand like, hey, this is going to be fruitful or this is not, and I need to move on to something else, right? It's probably what separates an expert red team from a novice red team. I remember, in fact, there's an example of this. I remember we were on an engagement, and Terry found some web server that said nobody's home, and I asked him, I was like, why would you go after this thing? And he's like, it said nobody's home. I know someone's home, and we ended up using that web server to get access to a corporate environment and to an OT environment. And I think that's kind of one of the shining examples of how red teams work, right? Where no one specifically pointed us to that specific web server. No one pointed us to that IP address. And as a red teamer, kind of Terry just knew that this is a way in, and spent some time figuring out how to get access to this one particular box and then leverage that box to get all the things that we needed, right? So that's, I think, it's kind of one of the differences between a red team and a pen test, so yeah, things like that, fond memories for sure.
Well, I think the interesting thing about that is when you look at the history, right? They had a pen test done
Yeah,
every year,
totally. Yep.
and the requirements were there. And when you look at the pen test reports, it was SSL vulnerabilities and
Yeah,
the common stuff you get if you ran a Nessus scan against the perimeter. But the reality of it was that server had been sitting there for at least 10 years.
totally.
And it
Yep.
had been there every time that this was run before that. So you just got to take a different perspective. And you're not, like Billy said earlier, you're not always looking for all of the avenues in or all those vulnerabilities. You're just looking for the one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
Let me
think
throw.
Predator style, there's technologies, custom technologies are always kind of big red spots on the heat map. People are always really big red spots on the heat map, right? Phishing is usually pretty effective. Taking advantage of people is usually pretty effective, so things like that for sure.
I'm going to throw this in as extra question here because I think it's kind of germane to this conversation. I know in a lot of OT environments today, the vendor is actually connected to the equipment in that environment and helping to monitor and maintain that equipment. How do you assess third-party vendor risk because of that external connection to a vendor?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a leader, right off the bat, whether you want to accept risk for your team assessing them or not, you inherit their risk. So, whether
Exactly.
you want to look at it or not, you inherit their risk. And I think, kind of back to the difference between red team and pen test, in almost every pen test, third parties are going to be out of scope, right? So, and I think almost every pen test I've ever done, third party infrastructure, third party systems out of scope. But red teams, you can flow to a third party, if that's the way in, that's the way in, right? And
Mhm.
so, and a good red team, I think, will be able to identify like, yep, this is the weak point, or this is a viable avenue in. And sometimes you don't even need to go. I think kind of back to the story of, nobody's home. Sometimes it just takes a few minutes of you looking and seeing like, this is what their infrastructure looks like. And right away that it's going to be a viable path in. I think, a good red team will be able to figure those things out for sure.
It's interesting when you said that is this is what that looks like. I think the number one question that we received, and I don't know if it's still the case, but it's still for me, Billy, is number one thing they ask when we get done delivering the report is how in the heck did you learn all of
Yeah.
this about our network in 2 weeks? Like, or 3 weeks? How did you, like, you guys are answering questions that our security team has had, you know, and that's the number one question though is how did you learn so much? And it's the approach. First off, it's important to understand that your network's not special. Right? You may have a different stack of tools, but it's the same stack of tools that everybody else has performing the same key functions. And from a red team perspective, the technology is indifferent to us. We want to understand, how you gain access to that technology, but really the key is, understanding that environment, going in and learning, how they connected it, what have they done. And that red team style approach allows you to do that at a higher level instead of just that, low-level vulnerability analysis level approach.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, what Terry brought up, I think is something that from an executive standpoint, we encounter all the time. I think a lot of the things that are actually implemented in network security and application security, IT security really don't matter, right? So we've, I can't remember, I won't say never, but probably never. I can't remember a time where, I'm in the middle of a red team or a pen test and stopped and asked the team like, wait, are these guys using NIST 800, or something like that, right? Like, it just, because to be honest, like, it just doesn't matter, right? So there are some things that do matter, right? Like, how good your network operations security team is, right? Like, man, that's definitely influenced things, right? So sometimes tools matter, but more often than not, they don't. Like, what type of host monitoring solution are you using? Most of the times, it doesn't matter. Sometimes it matters, every once in a while it will. Maybe they have it configured properly. They got all the right things turned on and they're actually monitoring it from a operational standpoint. But a lot of times it's just like fire and forget, right? Someone deployed it. It's out there. It's not configured properly. It's not working properly. They have some box check. They think it's going to stop something, but at the end of the day, it didn't matter, right? So as an executive, it might be good to just understand like, hey, I've got all this suite of tools. I've got this suite of things. What's actually making a difference? I don't think a lot of people ask that very often. I know Terry and I have definitely been in outbriefs where people have asked like, why didn't XYZ stop you? Or, XYZ technology was supposed to stop this, right? And you're like, no, like, like didn't even slow us down, right? So
We saw it on the headers, but it didn't do anything. We knew it was there.
yeah, that's usually the answer. Like, we knew it was there.
So this kind of leads into the next question then. Yeah, I mean, Terry, you mentioned cross-site scripting, right? We've been talking about that 20, 30 years, something
Yeah.
like that, but it still works, right?
Yeah.
So out of all the OT red team assessments you guys have done, what patterns or blind spots do you keep seeing over and over again that expose organizations like this to serious risk?
That's a
Yeah,
good
I'm sure I
question.
got a different answer than Billy does, but I want to hear yours first. Billy, go ahead.
Oh man. I think this is the uncomfortable piece of the OT side is, it's definitely people. I don't think organizations realize how much we steal from people as a red team or as a real hacker, like a real hacker will. Like, once the initial access is gained, we're sitting on those OT engineers' machines and we're just watching them do everything that they do. We're watching them go to SharePoint. We're watching them log into the VPN to get access to the OT. I wouldn't even say that those are quote vulnerabilities. Those are not CVEs. Those are not technical vulnerabilities. We're just watching them and just stealing everything that they do. We're reading their emails. And so, like I said, that makes people uncomfortable. But that's what's going to happen when someone actually gets access to the environment and wants to get access to OT, right?
Right.
And so, those outbriefs are pretty uncomfortable when you're showing someone's email inbox, and 99% of the emails we don't care about, but it's uncomfortable to have that. It's
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable to tell someone like, hey, we've been sitting on your machine for a week and we've logged every keystroke that you have, all your passwords, everything, every email that you've typed, every Word doc that you've typed. We have all that, it's uncomfortable. Most of the stuff we don't care about. It's very personal. We don't care about that stuff. We just want access. And so I think that's probably one of the trends that I've seen is I think people underestimate how much information someone can glean by sitting on people's machines and watching them, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also important to understand when you are talking about what can you see, right? There's different levels of access, right? As an attacker, you can get on, say, with say, for example, they have a sophisticated environment. They are using MFA. They're doing a lot of the things that make it so an attacker can't, steal somebody's credentials and go play around. But you can steal their tokens and you can bypass MFA with that approach. And by doing that, you can then gain access to their email box. And from their email, you can then send other targeted campaigns as an insider directly to others in the organization and find your way in. Uh, so attackers have time, right? And so what I think the biggest challenge and the biggest gaps I see in organizations is that time. How long does an attacker have to stay active on your network? And
Mm-hmm.
today, you see companies in this firefighting mode where they're trying to keep up with all these alerts as they're coming in. And in reality, 50% of those alerts are low-hanging things that they probably shouldn't have had to look at. So when you're talking about your response process and your response playbook, the things that a lot of organizations forget about are, how do you use the metadata around an incident, or how do you pull in data ahead of time that you know you're going to need, and then apply a technology to help make that decision with you or for you ahead of time before you have to look at it. So I can give an example. We sent phishing emails, and we like to target people like database administrators. Several
Totally.
reasons. One, they're probably running cron jobs. They can't turn off their machine readily. Rebooting's hard. But we've had more than one instance where that person who clicked on the link realized they did a bad thing, and they messaged the security team that same, like within 5 minutes of doing what they did. I think somebody's on my machine.
Yeah.
And it's 2 days later before they get a generic response, because they finally processed in their generic queue, and this person's told to reset their password. Well, they've already reset their password. They're literally cussing us out via their password. They know we can read their password. And it's like, okay, maybe there's somebody that would say, well, that user should have. It's like the user sent the email telling them he thinks there's an issue. And 2 days to respond is not a reasonable time frame.
Right.
So when you're looking at your response and that process, look for the things that are going to let your analysts make that decision very quickly. In other words, is little things. Is this person on vacation, or in the HR database? Are they out right now? And now they're doing something, right? That's something simple an attacker will take advantage of, right? Looking at what kinds of things are going on with the asset management of that device. Where is it located? Where is this login coming from? And again, back to, is that user on vacation? Are we expecting them to be logging in from Spain right now? Those take time for an analyst to go figure out. However, it's something that should be done every single time. Every single time there's an event, you should get the metadata around the computers that are associated, the users that are associated, and some information that gives you an indicator of whether this is a high alert or a low alert.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think a lot of organizations miss the mark today. It's the process that they need to use to validate whether something should be looked into or not. And without that, they spend time doing the wrong things.
Yeah, totally. I remember that mission, Terry. I remember we had this guy's database admin's password. We were using it for everything, and it stopped working. And we're like, oh, the password stopped working. And then we went back to someone went back to the machine. They're like, oh yeah, he changed it. Here's a new password. And maybe for 1 second you kind of feel bad for the guy, because to Terry's point, he had already emailed the security team, and we knew this because we're reading his emails. And no one
Should
from
have
the security
deleted it.
responded.
We're really mean.
No one from the security team responded for a couple days. And it's almost like, what chance does this one guy have against a team of red teamers that have been doing this for, at this point in time, a decade? The guys have got no chance, right? And for a couple days, we just ransacked everything this guy had, And then finally, when they came back and said, yeah, you got to change your password, it's like, we didn't care if he changed his password or not. We already had everything we needed, And
We had, in that instance, to give an idea, we had the Active Directory database dumped within 3 hours. 3 hours after that guy did his thing. And to have 3 days to do whatever we want, they would have never gotten us off that network.
yeah, I agree.
Never. If we were real attackers, the ransomware effects of what we did, I mean,
It would have been everywhere.
I wouldn't have done it, but the reality is that it would have been a huge issue for, I can't say who, but it would have been a huge issue, and that organization would have taken years to recover if
Totally.
they had
That
a
really
similar
puts
kind
in perspective the average time for IT to find out that there's a problem is 72 hours. In that time frame, the two of you could wreak a lot of havoc.
Totally. Yeah.
People need to keep you
But
guys on their good side.
that's another thing too, that's probably a common thread is once it goes, it goes. There's a lot of fighting. I think there's a lot of effort, a lot of head banging to get initial access and to kind of get a good foothold. And then usually there's one or two things that happen and then it's over. From that point forward, the red team is just rolling. They got so much momentum. And then within a matter, I think I agree with Terry, within a matter of hours, they become so entrenched where now you have a really hard uphill battle to try to get rid of their access.
Mhm.
So that's definitely seen something almost on every engagement. There's a couple things that just cause the whole snowball to roll.
So, Terry, in your backyard, there was a Washington State entity in 2024 who had a fairly well-known data breach, and it was kind of a perfect storm between legacy systems, forgotten vendors, and human error, all that contributed to that breach. If you're looking at similar factors like that, and we know that OT is full of legacy systems, contractor access, vendor access, and as you've mentioned, people, how do these weaknesses translate into real OT risk? And as a red teamer, what do you do to uncover those before an attacker does?
I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around just what attackers can do. When actually I know, so the assessment you're referring to, some of the things that happened there, when I've talked to the people that were in charge, a lot of them said, well, I had so and so from, they had a great history and, very one of the smartest people I know. And so I just assumed that my network was,
Mhm.
secure because I got the best people that I know. And I think the reality is a lot of people are focused on their picture of the pie, right? They got their environment, they know their piece of it, and maybe they know it really well, right? And then you got others who know they know their piece of the pie. And a lot of times it stops there because of the silos that are built within organizations, right?
Mhm.
You have your OT side of the house, your IT side of the house, your help desk side of the house, your security side of the house, and now all of a sudden the information that is needed to make these decisions quickly will be contained within individual silos where they each think they know their environment. And that is compounded by institutional knowledge that people just know, but nobody's written down.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that organizations face, and that attackers or red teamers can actually learn. They learn to navigate that, the things that everybody thinks they understand about this environment and how they're connected. A red teamer can come in there with a fresh mindset and just look at it and say, okay, looking at the technology stack, we can take this avenue, or, looking at taking a step back and saying, from this workstation, it looks completely different,
Mhm.
right? And realize that an attacker with the right scripts and tools, they don't have to be directly at that machine to relay through it and go, look at what's on the other side. You could set up proxies, and those proxies work quite well. It's it's almost like, running a scan directly from somebody else's machine, but you're sitting, outside the environment. And the rootkits that are around today just make it so easy for an attacker to do,
Mhm.
right? So recognizing that some of it's the technology stack, but the human side of it is where that institutional knowledge kind of gets stuck and lives in. And the reality is in order to respond as quickly as you need to an attacker, you need each of those buckets, and you need to be referencing them together so that you can make decisions fast enough to even catch what the
Yeah.
attacker's doing.
Yeah. I think, one thing I admire, it kind of leads to what Terry's talking about. One thing that I've always admired about Terry and probably other folks that are really good red teamers is they can identify differences really quickly, things that look different. And it kind of feeds back. And I think what Terry was talking about, right? Like when a web server was not deployed by the typical IT and security team, Terry can find that. Like that one-off web server that was deployed by the random dude, right? Like it just looks different for some reason. When the process is different than the normal process, like Terry's going to find that. And so, and those are those seams and gaps, that I think Terry's talking about, where like, someone didn't follow the typical hardening process. Someone didn't follow the typical, process for releasing something to the internet or getting something on the internet, you know. And I think good red teams find those really quickly as well. And those link back to that, operational and institutional pieces as well, right? Like folks that are trying to transition off of an old technology, legacy technology, and they forgot some piece out there. That's what a good red team is going to find. Some place where the process is accepted for some organization or group. That's what a good red team is going to find, right? And they're going to leverage that. I totally agree with that as well.
So let's change the conversation just a little bit and focus on the IT guy, right? The IT admin. Very long ago, I was on the IT side of the desk and ran an IT organization, and we were very good at what we did in managing IT and making sure people had access to email and their desktops worked and the servers worked. But when it comes to having the experience needed to secure an OT environment, what's the delta there? What's the experience gap, and how does that put an OT environment at risk? And what should organizations do about that gap?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to go first here, Terry. I think this is a really good question. And to be honest, I think not just IT, but other organizations within a business. A lot of times the organizations are so stovepiped, they actually don't know what the organization does. So they don't know how important the OT network is to safety or operations. They don't realize that, one shard of access to OT environment and the business is impacted. They just can't comprehend that, right? So, and it's usually not their fault. Like email goes down and it's not the end of the business. SharePoint goes down, it's not the end of the business. They get it back up within a reasonable amount of time within the organization. And you carry on, right? That's just kind of a normal week for an IT person, right? So, but what they don't understand is that OT environment's just way different. If that critical manufacturing component gets compromised and ransomed, or worse, taken over and cause some safety incident or some irreversible catastrophe, which can happen in OT, like that's going to have some huge impact on the entire business, And so I think a piece of that is to make sure that folks that are running critical components to the business, like IT, it's almost a critical component for every business, make sure that they understand actually how vital their role is in protecting some of these systems. Let them walk the manufacturing floor. Let them walk the data center for the power distribution system. Let them walk, the floor to understand exactly how the business does its thing and how these systems are relying on the security mechanisms that are in play. And their role is essential to that, right? Because I think a lot of times they just don't understand how essential it is, so.
I 100% agree with you. And it's interesting as we've gone into more and more organizations and work with them and looking at the way that the IT organization or the security operations center approach things versus the way that the OT organization approaches things. It's crazy to see what happens when you take an organization through an exercise and you ask the OT organization what they'll do in a certain situation and ask the IT organization what they would do. And then the security operations center and you get three different answers, right? You get the OT organization who has their procedures and they are tuned for safety and uptime, right? Reliability. But very rarely are they looking for security concerns. And it's not one of the lenses that they typically put on their environment. Whereas then you take the security operations center and they're putting the lens of, I want to understand all the alerts and anomalies and we're going to try to digest those. But they won't understand that OT environment once it gets outside of the traditional protocols they're used to using, right? Which is a very small set of protocols. If you look at a traditional security operations center, the things they're looking at, it's not a big stack. It's a lot of data, but it's not a big stack of data.
Totally.
Whereas on the OT side, they have a lot more different types of data sets.
Right.
They mean different things. but you still have that access side. And the IT folks, they have their administration view, right? They want to make sure people can log in, like Billy said. They're looking at it from that perspective. But in the OT environment, they might not have any of that visibility at all. It might have its own Active Directory. It's going to have its own setup. The OT folks actually configured that. And so then you have the SOCs in there saying, well, how do we get visibility? And they're saying you don't have visibility. And you have the IT folks who don't have visibility. So you just have to realize that sometimes there are things that each silo understands about an environment. These exercises are designed to break those down. And Billy pointed out earlier, when you break down those barriers, some people aren't happy about it because what you're doing is you're pointing out, the OT folks follow their standard process, and that is they reboot it. The SOC folks want to send in an incident responder who can't get logs off of it because it's been rebooted. And then at that point, you don't have any visibility. You're back to whatever's on the network layer. Right? So it's important to understand these roles and realize that they don't talk to each other today.
Right.
From a cyber fusion perspective, that is the concept, is you break down some of those barriers and you help them communicate their side of that story.
Yeah, I think it's gotten better. I remember when I worked at PAC Cert for DISA, the Pacific Cert, I remember we used to whack boxes with like little regard to the user, right? Like, hey, we think your box is compromised and you're going to get rolled, and then you'd get these irate emails like, I lost, documents and blah, blah, like, we don't care, and I think that's kind of a very, IT-ish mentality, like, hey, the network comes first. And, I want to make it a good experience for the user, but if you're endangering the network, you got to go, and then that mentality just doesn't work in the OT side, right? Like, you can't just whack a box. You can't just take something off the network if it's acting weird or, putting out suspicious network traffic. It's definitely different. It's a different approach there, right? So you can't just take that traditional approach into OT, right? So, and then there's probably some things that the OT folks can learn from the IT folks, right? Like, to be honest, I think escalation of incidents has gotten way better, especially cybersecurity incidents has gotten way better on the IT side, right? Like, I remember when we first started doing pen tests and red team, like there basically was no escalation. I remember, I probably shouldn't be saying this on a podcast, but I remember playing around on my like university network, and like the admins, it was just us and the admins going back and forth, and the admins were calling us dirty names and we were calling them dirty names. And then at the end of the week, we just kind of went our way. That would never happen today. That would get escalated so quickly, and it would be out of the admin's hands within a couple hours. And then it would be, you just couldn't do something like that today. Right. So, but to Terry's point, in the OT environment, a lot of security incidents aren't considered security incidents. They're just considered reliability incidents. And, a lot of times it's hey, we're just going to restore this or redo this and then be on our way. And there's no follow up on whether or not it's a security incident. Right. And that's something that the OT folks can probably learn from the IT folks.
100%
So
agree.
in IT, we talk about risk, right? In OT, we talk about resilience because it's all about keeping the production line running 24/7, right?
Yep.
So you've done your red team assessment. It's time to deliver the bad news. What does that message look like? What does success look like beyond the report? And how do you define OT resilience for them as you're delivering that report?
When you're looking at the OT environments, you have to realize the reliance that they have on each other, right? One system can cause a cascading failure to the rest, right? And you can see that attackers are getting more sophisticated around how they perform these attacks, depending on whether it's a nation state actor who has incredible amounts of time and playbooks that they could potentially burn a 0-day. Like Billy and I used to talk about this all the time, that burning a 0-day is expensive, and it was expensive 15 years ago. It's really expensive today. Right? Burning a 0-day, that means you had an initiative, and you think about the bounties that are out there. And if you burnt a 0-day, it's sometimes you're burning $1 million plus, right? Just cash
And time too.
and
Yeah.
time, right? But when you're looking at the way that the attackers actually approach this, they're not burning 0 days unless they have to, which means they go in, they're low and they're slow and they're quiet and they're methodical and they think through what they're going to do, and they gain an understanding of the environment, and they gain an understanding of where they can impact things, right? And so when you're looking at it from a red team perspective, we're looking at what can an attacker do, what kind of knowledge can they learn about this environment just from basic techniques that we've been talking about, right? Information gathering, looking at network traffic, right? If you can get network captures, that'll tell you where the different protocols are being used to communicate across your environment. So for example, what does your Siemens environment look like? What does your Honeywell environment look like? They use their own protocols. You can map those protocols, and you have to take a step back and look at some of the things that are under the hood that maybe people aren't thinking about. Network time servers, right? NTP is such a critical thing when you're talking about response and you're talking about an environment. Not only do you have the time to share across those different devices, but when you go back and you do your log analysis, right? If somebody's changed the log, changed the time on one of these devices, you may not even be looking in the right window, right? So you have to think from an attacker's perspective. They can do things to hide those logs. As a red team, when you were looking at it, it's going through those services. What does your NTP environment look like? What does your DNS environment look like? These are some of the critical things that attackers can easily digest. Right? It is one of the easiest things on the network to do, to go connect to a DNS server and pull information about everything that's on the network, right?
Yeah.
No authentication really required for that. It's just a network level protocol. Learning about the network environment and the time environment and those sort of things, and that those present clear attack vectors that are just overlooked. We've never been the malicious people that are going to shut down a service, but there's always going to be things up at the higher level, that app layer. If somebody's truly looking to compromise an environment, you take out 3 or 4 of those key services and they're going to have to rebuild the entire thing.
I think it kind of goes back to the difference between red team and pen test. Usually the red team outbrief culminates in an effect.
Yep.
Just hypothetically, like for a hospital, it would be the red team gained access to a system and killed a patient, right? Like as a scenario. And they were able to do this by this step, that step, this step, that step, right? And so obviously, if it's a red team, they're not going to actually, do the last step, but they will show you all the way up into that last step, like, hey, we can do this. Without a doubt, we can do this, or we could have done this.
What's
And
the key
so,
phrase there, Billy? Patient harm. And if you're talking about patient
yeah,
harm,
exactly, right?
now we're listening.
And so I think the worst case scenario, we've definitely seen this, is someone gets the outbrief. There's a bunch of findings in there. They do nothing. You do another red team a couple years later. It's all still accessible. You still do this exact same path, and you get to where you need to be. I think the mediocre organizations take the report and fix all the bugs. Like they literally just use it as a list and they fix the bugs. But I think the best and most strategic organizations understand the effect piece and do things to stop someone from initiating an effect like that, whether it's in the report or not. So they know that someone is able to do it. They take a look at the report and they use the report as a guidance for their strategy to stop the effect. So they're not just fixing bugs, I think those are the best organizations. If you have an executive, a risk management executive, a CISO or a CSO that can kind of understand it at that level, that's what you want, right? So you don't want someone who doesn't do anything, of course, but if they're just blocking and tackling and fixing bugs, that means they actually don't really understand what just happened, right? Someone had defeated essentially their security program to accomplish some means, and fixing the bugs is not going to stop that. It's a path that the red team took, but just fixing those bugs is not going to stop it. And someone that can take that report and digest it and create these strategic initiatives to stop someone from doing those things in the future, that's what you want, I think, from an outbrief, a red team outbrief. So.
Yeah, it's really that critical attack chain analysis,
Totally.
right? What are the critical attack chains that an attacker can leverage in your environment today?
Right.
And people are often surprised at what that really looks like. And like, oh, okay, well, we didn't implement, role-based controls accurately in this particular environment, and now you understand everything you need to get in there because you were able to find the data.
Here's an example, right? So let's just say hypothetically, two good-looking guys named Terry and Billy hacked a garage system and used that to get access to a corporate venture capital network, right? And so, the tactical fix would be like, well, let's just patch the garage piece. The more strategic thinking is, why is the garage network on my corporate network?
Mm-hmm.
Why does the garage controller have access to things that are sensitive to my network? Confidential startup pitches, right? And so that's the
Why
more
was it
strategic
on the
piece.
internet?
Why is the garage controller on the internet, right? What other control systems do I have that are directly accessible to the internet? That stuff may not be in the report, as findings, but a good executive can look at that and be like, what, the garage system represents some interconnectivity that I didn't know about that has access to the most sensitive things that my organization cares about. I'm going to take steps to make sure that no control system can do that in the future, not just a garage controller, right? So that's just an example of how someone could maybe take a red team outbrief and use it strategically.
All right, very good. Well, that's going to wrap up today's powerful, if not somewhat scary conversation with Terry and Billy, two leaders who spent decades exposing what really happens when cyber meets the physical world. If there's one takeaway from today's episode, it's this. Penetration testing finds vulnerabilities. Red team assessments expose consequences.
Yep.
The question isn't whether your system has vulnerabilities. It's whether your organization can detect, contain, and recover from a real attack when it crosses that invisible line between IT and OT. That's where PhishCloud's OT Red Team assessments come into play. Safety emulating real-world adversaries across your entire environment without disrupting production. It's about proof, not paperwork. It's about performance, not policy. To learn more, visit PhishCloud.com to see how PhishCloud can help you build resilience where it matters most, at the intersection of technology, operations, and people. Because as Terry and Billy reminded us today, in operational technology, the cost of inaction isn't a fine. It's downtime, it's damage, it's danger. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cyber Fusion Report. Until next time, stay safe out there. This has been the Cyber Fusion Report podcast. Thanks for joining us. And for more information, please visit www.phishcloud.com or email us at cfc@phishcloud.com. Thanks and have a great day.